The most important piece of territory during the First World War was not in Europe, but actually in Africa. Being between two major continents, Egypt was absolutely crucial to the victory of the Allies in World War I. This video will explain the country's supreme role as a British colony, how it could have led to a German victory, and the result of this on today's world. If this is your first time on the channel and you want a credible source of information on Egyptian politics, Middle Eastern politics, or global politics in general, you can subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on anything. I put all scholarly and non-scholarly sources cited APA style in the description below. Egypt's role in the British Empire. It's no secret why Egypt was so important to the empire. The Suez Canal. The canal was, and still is, the shortest maritime route between India and Great Britain. Nonetheless, it should still be stressed just how important the Suez Canal and the rest of Egypt was, because it played a role in the British Empire that allowed the United Kingdom to remain rich and powerful in ways that Germany and even France could not. To start with, Egypt connected the world not just east to west, but north to south. When Britain gained control of the Egyptian Khedive in 1882, it inherited with it the rest of Sudan and owned land as far south as Uganda. Over time, the British were able to set up the East Africa Protectorate in modern-day Kenya, solidifying their control over almost all of Northeast Africa. The British had essentially established a land route between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean that cannot be blocked off except by invasion. While the maritime routes would be used more often and were more efficient, the presence of Britain in this area meant that a wide swath of the continent was not under the control of France or Germany. While this may seem mundane and obvious, it should be highlighted because it resulted in the United Kingdom accessing a large chunk of the world instead of its rivals doing so. This wasn't the only large chunk of land the British possessed. Other large chunks of land included Australia, Malaysia, and India, occupying the Indian Ocean on all three sides. A massive pool of resources and goods was available to the United Kingdom that went only to the United Kingdom, and not Germany or France. This ties back to Egypt in one key way, and it's that this massive pool of goods had to cross the Suez Canal to reach Europe in the fastest time possible. How a German victory could have been possible. We can furthermore compare Britain's imperial possessions with Germany, for example, who had only a handful of colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Because of this, the Germans weren't as reliant on overseas colonies for their power as the British and French were. On top of this, the Germans had the most modernized and advanced industries and technologies in the world at the time, and it had a massive population to back it up. In fact, Germany had a bigger population and landmass than both France and the United Kingdom, and went to war with a standing army second only to that of Russia, who was magnitudes larger than Germany. Much of Germany's manpower and resources were either within the home country itself or imported from colonies that were relatively close. Germany was not as reliant on international supply lines as the British Empire was, and this came with an upside and a downside. On the one hand, Germany didn't have access to the same level of massive wealth and resources in Africa and Asia. On the other hand, however, because the British did, they were more reliant on global supply lines. Germany was reliant heavily on food imports, however, which were blockaded by the British and were a leading factor for Germany's defeat in World War I. Nonetheless, even then the Germans were able to evade the blockade by importing food from the Netherlands and Sweden, both of whom were neutral states. Germany's flexibility proved to be a potentially game-changing advantage when the Ottoman Empire joined the war. A large portion of Britain's military and economic strengths were based off the fact that it traded heavily with its colonies and took resources from it. For example, over 1 million Indian soldiers were sent to fight for the British Army, many of them going to the Western Front to fight the Germans. That's without mentioning other important supplies the British imported from their colonies such as cotton, ammunition, and leather. The Turks technically only needed to take over the eastern bank of the canal to disrupt traffic, and only needed to occupy the Sinai Peninsula instead of the entirety of Egypt. With this in mind, the Ottomans captured the entirety of Sinai in 1915, and were on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. The British, though, invested heavily in defending the western bank of the canal. After the Ottomans took over El Arish in northeastern Sinai near Gaza, it made more sense for the British to use the Suez Canal as a natural line of defense between Egypt and the Ottoman forces. This proved effective because crossing a body of water put the Turks in a position where they could not attack and where the British didn't have anything to do but attack. Despite this seeming difficulty, the Ottomans had believed the Egyptians would revolt against the British occupiers, especially after the Ottoman Caliph called for a jihad against the British, Russians, and French. This revolt did not materialize, however, and Egyptian forces continued to take part in defense of the canal. The Turks were able to only cross the canal once when they briefly reached the city of Ismailia, until they were repulsed back by the British, never to make landfall again. If the Ottomans had been successful, it is possible that the British Empire would be split in half, and more troops would have to be redirected from the Western Front to defend Egypt, in which case either Egypt would have to fall to the Ottomans, splitting the entire empire in two, or less resources would be dedicated to the Western Front, potentially leading to a German victory. The British in the end were able to defend against the Ottoman attacks, as they had fortified and defended the canal's western bank to a massive degree. Even with that, however, not many people realized the importance of the canal to Britain's wartime efforts. Many British people at home thought that the Western Front was the most important battle, especially as the Western Front was becoming increasingly gruesome and costly. Moreover, a few months after the successful defense of the canal, Britain launched a disastrous invasion of Western Anatolia, with the aim of eventually capturing the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits and establishing a line of passage to Russia. The invasion turned out to be a catastrophe, killing tens of thousands of Allied soldiers and just as many Ottomans. This may have affected the Suez defense by emboldening the Turks, who were victorious in Anatolia, and by sending the surviving Allied troops to defend Egypt instead. As World War I went on, however, the Ottoman Empire faced many military difficulties and internal revolts, never really making any new gains. The Germans were also stuck in stalemate in Western Europe. Eventually, however, due to the Ottoman Empire's difficulties, the British were able to retake control of the Sinai and solidify their control of the peninsula. After the British regained control of the Sinai, they launched an invasion of Ottoman-controlled Palestine and Syria, while simultaneously moving in on Baghdad from the east. Egypt proved important in this regard as it held the lines of communications between everything east and west of the Suez Canal. It was also important as a base from which to attack Ottoman-controlled Arab territories. In 1918, with much of the empire under British occupation, the Ottomans surrendered. Following its surrender, its territories came under British and French control, creating the borders we all know and love today. Because the Germans couldn't cut off Britain's global supply chains, the Western Front ended up being a stalemate with no side really gaining the advantage. Moreover, imports from the Indian Ocean through Egypt and to the Western Front served as a lifeline for the British, while Germany continued to struggle with food shortages as a result of the British blockade. Eventually, political turmoil took place throughout the country. Britain's support from the colonies was complemented by the entry of the United States, which tipped the balance of the Western Front in favor of the Allies, and the Germans eventually surrendered. In conclusion, Egypt played a very important role in connecting the British Empire's massive supply lines. It was responsible for the movement of goods from east to west, without which the British could not have continued to fight against the Germans. It also helped lead to the downfall of the Ottoman Empire by acting as a base from which to attack Ottoman-controlled territories in the rest of the Middle East. If you found this video useful, you might be interested in the video explaining how Israel took down Egypt in 6 days. And if you have no use for that, you might find another video explaining why Iran hates Egypt to tell you a bit more about the drama between the two. Thank you for watching.